What's a horrible secret you saw as a child but only realized later how awful it was? Story 1. I grew up in an evangelical, unaffiliated church. They believed in speaking in tongues, demon possession, and exorcisms. A local boy I befriended, around 12 to 14 years old at the time, lived in the apartments near our church. He was poor and rough, often using harsh language and smoking, generally fending for himself. On Sundays and Wednesday nights, he began coming over to the church. One night, for some reason, someone decided they needed to lay hands on him and pray for his soul. He didn't appreciate that, so he pulled away and shouted angrily at them. This was taken as clear evidence that he was possessed. Several adults dragged him out of the pew, holding him down while he screamed, struggled, and shouted at them for the next couple of hours. Eventually, he was exhausted and bruised, and they were satisfied that the supposed demon had left. The 100 or so onlookers began praying, crying, and dancing around the scene. That was just a typical church night, maybe a bit more intense than usual. He never returned, and in hindsight, it's astonishing that the police were never involved. Similar things occurred multiple times throughout my childhood. It wasn't until I was an adult that I realized how truly disturbing it all was, how terrifying that must have been for him. Story 2. Being woken up by my mom screaming for help, my dad rushing in, grabbing my youngest brother, and desperately trying to revive him with CPR. It's one of my earliest memories. I was maybe 5 or 6 at the time. I didn't know what to do, and no one explained what was happening. It wasn't until the ambulance arrived that I was sent to a neighbor's house. My brother was born with a lung condition. It's been 18 years now, and I can't remember the exact name, and relied on a machine to help him breathe at night. PG&E had failed to notify us that they would be performing maintenance on a transformer outside, cutting the power. Because of that, his machine shut off and he suffocated overnight. At the time, I didn't fully understand what had happened, and it wasn't really discussed until years later. One night, I was in the car with my parents when Dreaming of You by Selena started playing. At that moment, it all hit me, and I broke down crying. I remember asking my parents why he had to be taken from us and telling them how much I missed him. To this day, I still can't listen to that song. Rip Baby David, someday I'll see you again. Story 3. I've seen my father get arrested so many times in my own home. There were times when the police busted through our door with guns drawn, times when our house was raided. Everything flipped upside down and turned to chaos. I never understood it, until I was about 13. I had my best friend over for a sleepover, and he found my father's stash hidden in the rafters of the basement, right where my room was. It may not seem too extreme, but looking back, the number of transients and overall sketchy people my father had around us, sometimes even letting them live in our house, is something I could never imagine exposing my own family to. To me, putting your kids in situations like that is beyond irresponsible. And this wasn't just a phase. It was my entire childhood. At times, he even had addicts with kids staying with us. It's surreal to think about now as an adult. That being said, I never thought of my childhood as a bad one. It was all I knew. But once I grew up, once I realized that this wasn't normal, and once all the family secrets started coming out, I understood. It wasn't as innocent as I had convinced myself it was. Story 4. High school student, early 90s, weekend job printing photos. Mostly boring, but sometimes interesting, especially for a teenager in a quiet and uneventful town. This was pre-digital, so we processed all kinds of photos. Besides the usual houses, cars, boats, and family vacations, we'd get drunk party pictures, aspiring model shots, risque girlfriend or wife photos, and sometimes even outright explicit images. I saw and learned a lot. Most of the time, the store owner had an unspoken arrangement with certain customers. If they brought in sensitive rolls of film, he would personally develop and print them after closing, allowing them to pick up their photos discreetly later that night. Occasionally, though, someone unfamiliar with this arrangement would walk in and ask a series of obvious questions. How fast can you print these? Do you have any restrictions? Do you look at the photos after you print them? Clearly trying to gauge how private the process was. We had a price and rules sheet, and while we technically didn't have to look at the prints, we did see the negatives during development. Most people were fine with that. Some, however, would insist on only developing the film, not printing any photos. One Saturday morning, a middle-aged couple walked in and watched me work for a while before approaching the counter. They quietly asked about developing film only. I assumed it was just another set of adult photos, So I quickly loaded their film into the developer. They seemed nervous while waiting for their negatives, which wasn't unusual, but something about them felt off. The printing machine was fully visible from the front of the store, but the film developer was partially hidden behind a half-height wall near the entrance to the back. I continued working while mentally keeping track of the timing. I wanted to grab their negatives and sneak a look. Hey, I was a curious teenager. Around this time, another employee returned from break, and the store got a little busier. Perfect. I used the distraction as an excuse to step away, telling my coworker I needed to grab more print envelopes from the back. I pulled the film straight out of the developer and held it up against the overhead light for a quick glance. Shock, then disgust, then rage. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as the realization sank in, but I had to be sure. I placed the negatives on a light board and grabbed a magnifying loupe. I looked at exactly one image. Then I picked up the phone and called the police. There's really no way to describe what I saw. The photos were definitely explicit, but the subjects were not adults. I quickly told the dispatcher what I had found and that the couple was still in the store. There was a brief silence before she asked me how certain I was. 100%. Minutes later, the store was filled with police. At some point, the couple had tried to slip out the door, but officers stopped them before they could leave. I have kids of my own now, and sometimes when I drop them off at school or watch them playing in a crowded park, I get a flashback of that single image. Instant fear, instant sweat, and the constant gnawing worry. Who among us hides the worst of secrets? Story 5. Still a high school student, early 90s, about 7 months after the previous event. Nearing graduation, senioritis was definitely setting in. My friends and I were a tight-knit group, 4 of us at the core, with about 5 others who were part of our circle. We were a mixed bag of backgrounds, some poor, some well-off, different races, a blend of ethnicities and a variety of religious or non-religious beliefs. What we had in common was our love for nerdy things. D&D, video games, math, science, debate, and anything that let us overanalyze and overthink. This story revolves around Ben, not his real name. Ben was a tall, moderately stocky Irish kid who loved wearing cowboy boots and big belt buckles. He had a good heart, but hid it behind a sharp, sarcastic wit. He was always messing around, trying out crazy wrestling moves he picked up from watching WWF, WCW. He could have been great at sports, but he was too anti-establishment, too defiant of authority. He was always a scrapper, never afraid to fight, and fiercely protective of our group. But he also knew how to laugh at himself. Once we watched a George Carlin HBO special, and he laughed so hard he sharted. And then he laughed even harder about that. Unfortunately, Ben's family struggled. It was just him, his mom, and his much younger half-brother Billy. Not his real name. No sign of either father. His mom worked restaurant jobs to make ends meet. They moved around a lot, but always stayed within our school district. I always felt like his mom knew how much our group meant to him and did everything she could to keep him close. At the start of our senior year, they had to move out of the district. Ben's mom filed a request to let him finish school with us, but the administration used it as an excuse to get rid of him. He wasn't a great student, and he had a history of minor fights at school. He and his mom fought to stay, eventually getting a meeting with the principal to argue their case. It didn't go well. The principal insinuated that Ben's mom was a bad mother for not being able to afford to stay in the district. Ben snapped. He broke the principal's jaw and his own wrist in the process. He spent the night in jail, then weeks in juvenile hall. Of course, he was expelled. I blame that single event for everything that followed. With juvie time and the distance to his new home, Ben was effectively cut off from our group. We wanted to see him, but we didn't have the means to visit as often as we used to. We stayed in touch, tried to keep his spirits up, but you could tell he was sinking. A few of us went to the school counselor to ask for help, but Ben was persona non grata with the administration. They told us to contact his new school instead. We tried, but his new school didn't even have a counselor. The secretary dismissed us, saying that almost all the kids there are depressed. It's a school for delinquents. Complete bullsh. Time passed, and we talked to Ben less and less. By spring, graduation was in sight. I was still working weekends at the photo store, saving for college. My family wasn't wealthy enough to pay for tuition, but just middle class enough to disqualify me from a lot of financial aid. I worked every extra shift I could, and one Friday night, I worked a shift I shouldn't have. Our store was always understaffed. There was too much film to process in a single day, so the owner let me stay late on Fridays to catch up. I don't remember the exact time that night, but I know it was dark outside and puddles were left from recent rain. It was probably the 100th roll of film I had printed. At first, I thought it was just a terrible photographer. Dozens of close-up pictures of carpet and walls. Sometimes negatives are hard to decipher before printing. Then I saw other things. A hat, a liquor bottle, and a couch. An old couch, faded and fraying at the seams. I had sat on that couch many times. Ben's couch. But something was wrong. A piece of the armrest was missing. I told myself it was just a similar couch and kept printing. More familiar yet unfamiliar images appeared, distorted by the negative's reversed colors. It felt surreal, almost like a dream. Then I saw the body. Lying on that old faded couch, tall, arms askew, one foot on the ground, the other dangling off the couch's edge. Wearing cowboy boots, Ben's boots, I blanked out. My hands kept working, finishing the roll by sheer habit. Then I just sat there in silence, staring at the printer, tears slowly falling from my right eye. A strange detail I still remember. Why only my right eye? The owner noticed something was wrong and came to check on me. I didn't say anything. I just stood up, walked to the printer tray, and flipped through the photos until I found the one of the body. I held it up to him and said, "This is Ben." The owner knew Ben's story. He immediately understood why I was breaking. He took the photos, hugged me, and sat with me in the back room. He let me cry, let me question everything, encouraged me to let it out instead of bottling it up. Eventually, he called my mom, told her I was okay, but that she needed to come pick me up. Normally, I would have walked home. When my mom arrived, I mechanically got into the car. I was completely numb, probably in shock. She was obviously worried, maybe thinking it was another CP case. So she stepped out to talk to my boss. They spoke in hushed voices, but I still heard them. Our store sometimes processed evidence photos for the police. That night, I had developed the crime scene photos of Ben's death. The official news came the next day. Suic, shotgun to the mouth. Much later, we learned the full story. When Ben broke his wrist, the doctors found an irregular heart rhythm. That led to an MRI, which led to the discovery, advanced cirrhosis of the liver, a rare genetic condition that affects some Irish people. Ben knew his family could never afford treatment, so he made his choice. Seeing the photos was hard, but I can't even imagine what it was like for his little brother, Billy. He was home when it happened. He heard the gunshot. He ran to help. But what could an 8-year-old do? He watched, helpless, as his big brother choked on his own blood and died in front of him. Story 6. When my sister and I were kids, about 6 or 7 years old, my dad would have us play a game whenever our mom was in the hospital. The rules were simple. Whoever found the most bottles of pills won. We didn't know why our mother was always sick or why she was constantly in and out of the hospital. It was just how life was for us. She died when I was 9. Fast forward to when I was 17. I was going through a particularly dark time in my life, something I'd rather not talk about, and came home crying to my dad. Eventually, he told me that he understood what I was feeling. That's when he revealed the truth. My mother had been an addict, and she had been making herself sick. At that moment, a long-buried memory surfaced. The game we played as kids, what it really was. Story 7. When I was little, we had a sweet old man living next door named Mr. Culpepper. He was the textbook kind neighbor, always cheerful, always baking cookies for everyone in the cul-de-sac. You'd see him whistling while watering his lawn, chatting with birds as he tended to his garden. Then one Sunday after church, we came home to several police cars parked outside his house. My dad told me and my sisters to stay in the car while he and my mom went to see what had happened. When they returned, my mother was crying, and my father was stone-faced. Years later, when I finally asked what had happened to Mr. Culpepper, I learned the truth. He had shot himself in the head. Even worse, it was because his kids never came to visit, and he was terribly lonely. I still think about him. He didn't deserve to go out that way. Story 8. My dad and I were in a plane accident. Not exactly a crash, but it came close. Somehow the front of the plane caught fire. The entire cabin lost pressure, and we plummeted from cruising altitude to around 1,000 feet at a 45-degree angle. The flight was supposed to go from Florida to Connecticut, But instead, we had to make an emergency landing in Savannah, Georgia. At one point, a flight attendant sobbed over the intercom, telling passengers to call their loved ones and say their goodbyes. That's how serious it was. The veteran pilots absolutely saved our lives. But at the time, I didn't realize how bad it was, because my dad played it perfectly. I remember asking him why there was smoke coming from the front of the plane. Without missing a beat, he told me the pilots were having a barbecue. When we started plummeting, I asked him why, and he simply said, "Sometimes you have to do that when flying." Because of him, what could have been a traumatic memory wasn't. To this day, though, my dad refuses to get on a plane without being heavily medicated. And just recently, 13 years later, my parents told me that after we got home that night and I went to bed, they sat in the kitchen and cried for an hour straight. Story 9. When I was little and my mom was out of the house, my dad was in charge of watching me and my brother, but he never actually watched us. He'd tell us to watch TV, then disappear into his room. Every so often, he'd come out and start turning random lights on and off. He never said a word to us, never looked at us. And then there was the smell. Whenever I got near his room, the air reeked, like burned popcorn, but worse. It was the most awful smell in the world. I'd ask him if something was on fire, but he'd just tell me to go away. Years later, after my parents' divorce, I finally put the pieces together. My dad had been smoking crack. It may not sound as extreme as other stories, but to me, that was what tore my family apart. That was why I haven't seen my father in nearly 8 years. Story 10. My dad was driving us to school and stopped at a mechanic's shop on the way to check on my stepmom's car. He parked parallel to the front of the garage so he could pull straight back onto our route. Since he expected to be in and out quickly, and it was 1988, he left the car running. About 30 seconds later, a man walked up to the car, got in, and tried to put it in gear. At 4 years old, I didn't think anything of it. Neither did my 6-year-old sister. We assumed he was a worker moving us out of the way. Then he turned to us and said, "Buckle up." To this day, the way he said it still sends chills down my spine. The car stalled when he tried to shift. Manual transmission, tricky clutch. That stall probably saved us. My dad sprinted out of the shop with a couple of other men, yanked the guy out of the car, and tackled him to the ground. I went to school that day, not realizing until years later that I had almost been kidnapped. Story 11. I was about 9 years old. Behind our school was a massive field that bordered a row of council houses. My friends and I always played at the farthest end of the field to avoid teachers. Mostly because we liked our imagination games, but also because of our school's very strict no hat, no play rule, and none of us had sun hats. One day we arrived at our usual spot to find an older man already there. He greeted us warmly and offered us berries, claiming he had picked them from a tree nearby. Then he told us he lived in one of the council houses. Being 9 and incredibly naive, we all ate the berries. Then he offered us a drink. We drank all of it. Shortly after, we started feeling weird. One of my friends threw up in class. That's when things escalated. Our teacher freaked out. Parents were called. Police showed up. It wasn't until years later that I realized what had really happened. The drink he gave us, it was alcohol. The man, he didn't live anywhere near our school. In fact, when I asked my mom about it in high school, she told me he was actually a registered sex offender. At the time, I had just assumed we had eaten something we were allergic to. Turns out we had barely dodged something much worse. Story 12. I was 6 years old when my mom was driving me and a few neighborhood kids home from a day at the beach. As we crossed a bridge, we passed an old man standing at the edge of the road. My mom glanced at her rearview mirror after we drove by. He was gone. This was before cell phones, so she immediately pulled over and started flagging down cars. Thankfully, one of the first cars had a CB radio and was able to call for help. Meanwhile, my friends and I looked down over the bridge. The man was lying on the train tracks below. My mom told us he had fallen and that he was going to be okay. I believed her. Years later, I found out the truth. He hadn't fallen, he had jumped. His wife of over 50 years had just died of cancer, and he couldn't go on without her. Story 13. When I was 4, my family moved to a really nice suburban neighborhood. It felt safe, quiet, the perfect place to grow up. One day, my mom was at work in the OR, and my dad was home watching me and my 1-year-old little brother. Suddenly, I saw my dad grab his gun and lock both of us inside my brother's bedroom. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Don't open this door for anyone but me." Then he ran outside. A few minutes later, I heard what I thought were fireworks. Curious, I ignored his warning, opened the door, and went outside to look. What I saw instead was a man across the street, shooting himself. Turns out there weren't fireworks. There was an armed man trying to shoot up our neighborhood. My dad, who was a cop at the time, was the first to respond since we lived right there, and it would take at least 15 minutes for any on-duty officers to arrive. At the time, I didn't fully understand what had happened. I was just confused. Now I realize that I watched someone take their own life. Story 14. A lot of my childhood was surrounded by domestic violence, but this story, one I only recently realized the full weight of, still haunts me. I was about 7 or 8 years old. My friend and I were playing in the woods right next to my house. These woods weren't dense, pretty sparse actually, and we were right by a pathway where you could still see my house in the distance. Then a stranger approached us. He was wearing a white tracksuit, had bleached, spiked up hair, and a sparkling earring on his left ear. There was something off about him. His features were sharp, almost snake-like. The closest description I can think of is Goldmember from Austin Powers, but more sinister. He smiled at us and asked, "Have you girls seen 2 little blonde girls around your height?" We said no, but he didn't leave. Instead, he started pushing us to help him find them. We hesitated. Something didn't feel right. Then he pulled his tracksuit bottoms down. He told us the missing girls like to touch this, and then he started pushing us to touch it too. We had no idea what we were looking at. We were just kids. Across the road was my school, which had a much denser, darker wooded area next to it. You couldn't see inside it from the street. That's when he said, "Do you want to go into those woods so you can get a better look at it?" I didn't understand what was happening, but something in my gut told me to get out of there. I blurted out, "I need to go home for dinner," grabbed my friend's hand, and walked away as fast as I could. It was morning. There was no dinner. I remember feeling dumb for saying that. When we got back, we told our older sisters about the weird man with a deformed belly button. We all just laughed because, at the time, that's all we thought it was. A guy with a weird belly button. Looking back, I realize how close we were to something so much worse. Story 15. When I was about 9, I was playing outside at a friend's house. Further down our street, there was a row of shops, and after they closed, we would play ball games behind them since there was a large wall we could bounce our balls off. One evening, we went down to play and found some money on the ground. Excited, we ran back to her house, feeling like we had stumbled upon a lucky break. But as we walked up the street, we kept finding more. Coins, a few notes, scattered along the way. By the time we reached her front door, our pockets were full. We ran inside, eager to tell her parents about our treasure, only to find more money on the floor inside the house. We picked it up too, and practically bursting with excitement, showed everything to her father. His reaction wasn't what we expected. He quickly took the money from us and said he would turn it in to the police. Then he told me not to tell my parents because we could get in trouble. That made me nervous. When I got home, I told my parents anyway. I was worried the police might come knocking, asking about the money. But instead of being concerned about me getting in trouble, my parents just told me to never mention it again, and they never let me play with that friend again. To this day, I wonder what was really going on that day. Story 16. My mom, great-grandmother, 2 sisters, and I were on a road trip home after visiting North Carolina. I remember it vividly because I was leaning forward between the front seats, showing my grandma something. Then my mom gasped. I looked up just in time to see an SUV flipping in the oncoming lanes of the divided highway. It didn't stop. The vehicle tore across the grassy median, over the divider, and into our lanes of traffic before finally crashing into a patch of trees on our side of the road. My mom immediately pulled over. This was around 1994 or 1995, and while cell phones weren't super common yet, my mom had one. She quickly called the police while other drivers rushed toward the wreck to try and help. I sat in the car staring out the window. Luggage was everywhere. Suitcases, bags, and clothing were scattered across the road, tangled in the trees. Then I noticed something close to the car, a square-shaped green case lying on the ground. At first, I thought it was a sweatshirt. Then I looked closer. It was a body folded in half. At the time, I didn't fully understand what I was looking at. I just pointed it out to my grandma, almost casually. We left soon after, since we weren't really able to help and would only be in the way of the ambulances. But I can still see that image in my head. Back then, I didn't associate it with death. It didn't even feel real. Later, I realized there was no way that person survived. The accident had been brutal. And thinking back now, I can only imagine how horrifying it must have been for my mom and the other drivers, watching a car flip out of control right into their path. Story 17. I helped my best friend's dad pack up their house. I was maybe 6 or 7 at the time, completely unaware of the magnitude of what was happening. To us kids, it was just a game. He told us we were packing for a camping trip, and we excitedly helped him load up the car. When we finished, he told my friend and me to head back into town where a parade was happening. He made us promise not to tell his wife, my friend's mom, because it was a surprise. At my age, I had no idea that he was actually abandoning his entire life. Turns out he emptied their bank accounts, took everything valuable, and disappeared. We were just excited about the idea of camping. An hour later, my friend's world had completely fallen apart. His mom lost the house, and they had to move away. I never saw my childhood friend again. Never heard from him, his mom, or his dad. Looking back, I realize how truly despicable that man was. Story 18. I swear I saw someone burying a body when I was 14 years old. I was riding my bike down a gravel road behind a cemetery in New Jersey when I saw it. An old, beat-up van parked nearby, a hole in the ground, a shovel, and a man dragging a large black garbage bag-covered object toward the pit. It looked exactly like something out of a mob movie. The man saw me, he froze. I didn't wait. I just turned my bike around and pedaled home as fast as I could. At the time, I tried convincing myself that I was just a kid, that I must have misunderstood what I saw. But now, over 15 years later, when I replay that memory in my head, I still think it could have been a body. Story 19. If we count the age of 15 as still being a child, I remember finding my then stepdad covered in his own urine, surrounded by empty vodka bottles and scattered pills. I told my mom, and she immediately called an ambulance. They took him, and my mom went with them to the hospital. Meanwhile, I felt the urge to do something, to help my mom in some way. So I cleaned up the room, wiping away the urine, picking up the pills, and throwing away the vodka bottles, all while my 10-year-old sister helped me. Only later did it dawn on me that he was a severe alcoholic, struggling with depression and anger issues, and that he had tried to take his own life that day. I remember instinctively covering my sister's eyes when they carried him out, fearing that if she saw everything, the image would be burned into her memory. 7 years later, she's still grateful I did that. Edit. Since people have asked about him, he was my stepdad, not my biological father, and my mom divorced him shortly afterward. He later emigrated to the US, and I never heard from him again, though I did find his Facebook profile. At least he seems to be alive. My mom has since remarried, and my new stepdad is a great guy. My sister and I never talk about what happened, and I only know from my mom that she sees a therapist. Whether it's because of that incident or for other reasons, I don't know. Story 20. When I was 9 years old, I watched a man die, with my best friend by my side. At the time, the road I lived on was gravel and led to lands owned by the local paper company. Our house was the last one before miles of logging roads and trails. My mom also happened to be a registered nurse. Because of its remoteness and the open roads, it was a popular spot for dirt bikers and ATV riders. Unfortunately, many mixed alcohol, drugs, reckless speed, and gravel roads, a dangerous combination. At least once a month, someone would stumble onto our doorstep, slurring their words and asking to use our phone. This was back in the 80s and 90s, before cell phones were common and before most people wore helmets. That day, it was just my mom, my best friend, and me at home. My dad was at work when we heard frantic knocking. A woman stood at the door, panicked and incoherent, but we could tell she needed help. My mom immediately dialed 911, telling dispatch that something bad had happened back on Deep Gap. They knew exactly what she meant. Without hesitation, my mom put us in the back of her Blazer and drove about a mile down the logging road. The victim, a kid, though I didn't realize at the time that he wasn't much older than 20, had lost control of his bike and crashed headfirst into a tree. Blood was everywhere, on the tree, on the ground, on his friends. His friends had dragged his body up onto the road, but the amount of blood pouring from his head was overwhelming. From the back window of the Blazer, my friend and I watched it all unfold, like a scene from a medical drama that hadn't been invented yet. The guy was unresponsive, and his friends were begging my mom to save him. She started CPR, working desperately to bring him back, while his friends, high and drunk, cried and pleaded. She continued until the paramedics arrived and took over. I remember watching her walk back to the car, wiping blood from her mouth and shaking her head. At the time, my friend and I felt disconnected from what had happened. We didn't process it as loss or even fully understand that the guy had died. We just knew one thing for certain: we would never ride dirt bikes. Only years later, as an adult, did I realize the full weight of that moment. Back then, HIV/AIDS was a major concern, and I now understand the risk my mom took when she performed CPR without protective equipment. She did it without hesitation, simply because a group of devastated friends needed her to try. I still think about that day often. It wasn't the last time I saw someone die in an accident like that while growing up, but being the first, it left a lasting impression. Story 21. When I was 13, I got upset with my mom while we were eating dinner at a pizza place. I stormed out to the parking lot to sulk. A middle-aged man driving a big old red and white convertible passed by, saw me and stopped to talk. He had 5 or 6 kids with him in the car, ranging in age from maybe 10 to 15 or 16. The strange thing was that none of them looked related, and some seemed to be nearly the same age. The guy told me they were heading to the laundromat and asked if I wanted to come along. So, I jumped in and went with them, just hanging out while they did laundry. He mentioned that they were just passing through town, then casually asked if I wanted to leave town with them. Luckily, I was starting to feel uneasy about the whole thing, so I declined the offer. They drove me back to the pizza place and dropped me off. Maybe it wasn't the most terrifying experience, but looking back, I think I barely avoided becoming part of something much darker. At the time, I just thought he was being friendly. Now I realize how much worse that situation could have been. Story 22. I grew up extremely poor. My late mother was a single parent, struggling to keep 2 boys fed and sheltered. We moved constantly when we were kids. My brother and I once counted and realized we had moved over 20 times before I even reached middle school. My mom was beautiful, but she was also a middle school dropout in the early stages of multiple sclerosis, so her options were extremely limited. At one point when I was around 8 or 9, we rented a place from an old landlord named Leland. He was a shady guy, and my mom often struggled to pay rent. Occasionally, we would make trips to his house. I hated going there, but I was too young to stay home alone. Every time we visited, my mom and Leland would go into another room while I sat in his living room, playing Super Punch-Out on his Super Nintendo. It wasn't until years later that I understood what was actually happening. My mom had been sleeping with him when she couldn't afford rent, just to make sure we had a place to stay. To this day, I can't see her play Punch-Out without being reminded of those memories. My mom sacrificed so much for us. I'll never be able to repay her for everything she did. Story 23. I watched my brother get hit and killed by a car. I was 5 and he was 7. I just remember my mom rushing him off to soccer practice because we were running late. The moment he got out of the car, the driver who hit him wasn't paying attention. He didn't stop in time. My mom flew out of the car screaming, pounding on the man's windows, begging him to stop. The driver said he thought he had hit a dog, which was why he hadn't stopped immediately. My brother was dragged for 75 feet before the car finally came to a halt. I still remember the deep scratches on his face, the ones that were impossible to cover for his viewing. I really need to go to therapy for this. It's been nearly 20 years, but now that I've finally put down the bottle, I'm starting to feel the trauma from that day. I get flashbacks all the time. I clench my teeth, force back the tears, and try to push the memory away. Mostly I grieve for my mom. We both witnessed it happen. That day we learned what real pain was, an unbearable kind of pain. I just wish he had passed from sickness or something else. Anything but that. Story 24. This might sound unbelievable, but I have a story. When I was around 13, I used to take the public bus to and from school with my friends. Among the kids on the bus, it was well known that girls avoided getting off at one particular stop because of a man who had a reputation for being creepy. Everyone said he would try to get them. He was always standing in his front yard, just a few steps from the bus stop, watching the bus as it passed. Something about him always felt sinister. We made sure our female friends and other girls never got off at that stop, treating it like a normal part of our routine. Instead, they would get off at the stop before or the one after. There were countless stories about him, firsthand and secondhand, about how he had grabbed someone, tried to touch them, or attempted to lure them into his house. Looking back, it's obvious that we should have told someone or called the police. But at the time, it was just something we thought about for 5 minutes every day before moving on, as if it wasn't a real danger. Story 25. When I was in primary school, I'm Australian, my first teacher, my prep teacher, was a really kind woman in her 50s. I was 5 turning 6 that year, and it was my very first year of school. After that year, I moved to a different school, but I still remember my last day there. When my mom came to pick me up, she went into the classroom after school and spoke with my teacher for a while. I remember watching them come out into the corridor, both of them crying. My mom gave her a big hug before coming over to get me. I assumed my teacher was sad because I was leaving, and I didn't want to upset my mom by asking what was wrong. Several years later, when I was around 9 or 10, my parents sat me down and asked if I remembered my prep teacher. I told them of course I did. Gently, they told me she had passed away and showed me a notice in the newspaper. I felt sad, and they explained that she had been sick with a disease. They told me the name, but at that age, I didn't really understand what it meant. Years later, I learned the full story. That day, my mom had been comforting my teacher because she had just been diagnosed with motor neuron disease, MND, also known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. Now that I understand how devastating and terrifying that disease is, it breaks my heart to think of how she must have felt. Receiving that diagnosis, knowing what lay ahead, I can't imagine how hard it must have been for her. Story 26. When I was a kid, I always got in trouble for being in the way. I would clog up the hallway, slow people down, block doorways, or lean too far into a walkway without realizing it. One Saturday morning, when I was around 7, I was sitting on the top step of our house, leaning back with my hands on the floor behind me. My dad walked out of his room and, without looking, stepped on my hand. He stood there sipping his coffee, chatting about weekend plans, what chores I had done, what still needed to be done, what he was planning for the day. I knew that if I complained, I'd just hear once again how I was stupid, worthless, and always in the way. So I smiled through the pain as he shifted his weight, pressing his boot into my hand, and answered as politely as I could, "Yes, sir," over and over. After that, I was extra careful not to be in the way anymore. Years later, I accidentally stepped on a bug and felt it wriggling beneath my shoe. And in that moment, it hit me. He had to know. He had to feel it. And yet, he had just stood there, smiling, sipping his coffee, making casual conversation, as he deliberately hurt a child. Story 27. I was about 15 or 16 when my mom locked my stepsister in the basement. That was the last time I ever saw her. I know that sounds like an age where I should have fully understood how terrible it was, but a lifetime of gaslighting, manipulation, and abuse really distorts your sense of reality. My mom had plenty of excuses. She claimed my stepsister had anger issues, had been violent, had thrown up at her, had mental health struggles, and refused to eat meals with the family. The truth looking back was far worse. My mom constantly antagonized my stepsister, who was probably only 10 or 11 at the time. She would sit her down and berate her over completely normal kid behavior, then get the rest of us to do the same. If my stepsister cried, begged her to stop, or got frustrated, my mom would mock her and call her names. She even claimed my stepsister had an alter ego that appeared when she was upset, but there was no other personality. She was just a child reacting to constant mistreatment. My mom would tear up her homework before school, then punish her when teachers asked why it was missing. If she disliked certain foods, she would be punished for saying anything about it. The worst incident was when she was sick, being yelled at and forced to eat something that made her nauseous. She threw up, but my mom made her eat it anyway. After that, she was locked in the basement. She was only allowed out once a day to use the bathroom. She went to school through the outside basement door, and when she returned, my mom locked her back inside. Her meals were barely enough, frozen dinners or just a plate with a few nuggets. I don't even remember if she got breakfast. The low-quality school lunches were probably the only decent meals she had. There were 6 of us kids in the family, but at the time, we were all just in survival mode, too focused on getting through each day to process what was happening around us. My oldest sister had already run away by then. She was 15 when she left. Around the time of the basement incident, I remember my mom getting angry at me, lifting me by my throat and slamming me against the wall. I went to school with bruises on my neck. My favorite teacher pulled me aside after class and gently asked about them, asking if I was okay. I lied. I told myself that other kids had it way worse, that real abuse looked different. Looking back, I now see that my stepsister wasn't treated much differently than the rest of us, except that she was younger. She hadn't learned to suppress everything the way we had, so her distress was visible, which made it easier for my mom to escalate her punishments. I also think my mom had a special resentment for her. She looked a lot like her biological mother, my stepdad's ex-wife, the woman my mom had always seen as a threat. Instead of feeling guilt for what she had done, my mom directed all that anger onto an innocent child. In the end, my stepsister was sent to a psychiatric facility for a month, then placed in a group home within 2 months. One by one, the rest of us left home. I stayed until college and then distanced myself from my family for years. Out of 6 of us, only one sibling still has contact with our parents. I haven't seen or spoken to my stepsister since the day she was sent to the basement. I wish I could tell her how sorry I am for not being a better big sister, for not helping her, for standing by while she suffered. I just hope she's okay. Story 28. Here are 2 stories, one that happened to my cousin and one that happened to me. On September 11th, my cousin was in middle school and just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center. He had gone to work with his mom that day. Right after the first plane hit, they saw a man step out of a cab and stand on the sidewalk staring at the tower for a moment. Then he pulled out his wallet, took out the cash, and tossed the wallet into a nearby trash bin. He did the same with his briefcase, removed his tie, and threw that away too. Without hesitation, he started waving for another cab, got in and drove off, heading away from the towers. For years, they never talked about it because it upset my aunt too much. But now they do. The leading theory is that he worked in the towers and took the moment as an opportunity to disappear, to leave everything behind. No one knows for sure, but my cousin remembers it vividly, and years later, the full weight of what he had witnessed finally dawned on him. The second story happened to me. When I was a kid, my sister and I went to Disney World with 2 of our neighbors, siblings in their early 20s. On the way, we got pulled over. The girl who was driving stepped out of the car, and the officer immediately pressed her against the vehicle. As he lectured her about safe driving, I saw him place his hand under her shirt. He kept talking while his hand moved lower, then under her skirt. I was sitting right by the window, and even though I couldn't fully process what was happening at the time, I could hear everything. At one point, another car drove by and honked, and the officer casually waved at them without stopping what he was doing. This went on for about 15 minutes before he finally let us go. She got back in the car, visibly shaken, and her brother muttered, "Better than getting a ticket." She shot back, "Screw you, Tommy," and drove us home. Story 29. When I was in 2nd and 3rd grade, my family carpooled with another family to school since it was a bit of a drive. Let's call them the Johnsons. Each week, my mom and Mrs. Johnson would take turns driving the kids in the morning and picking them up after school. Every now and then, during a Mrs. Johnson morning, Mr. Johnson would unexpectedly show up instead and take us to school. It wasn't a regular occurrence, but it happened enough for me to remember it. There was also one particular morning when Mrs. Johnson was different. She was unusually upbeat, driving fast while singing along loudly to the radio. Way more energetic than she normally was. I never thought much of it at the time. But years later, after we had moved states away, my mom mentioned that the Johnsons were getting a divorce because Mrs. Johnson had been caught having an affair. My mom wasn't surprised, saying that Mrs. Johnson had a drinking problem. Apparently, every time Mr. Johnson drove us instead, it was because Mrs. Johnson was too intoxicated from the night before to take her turn. Some days she hadn't even made it home at all. I never told my mom this, but looking back, I'm almost certain that on our sing-along ride, we were being driven to school by someone who had just finished a major binge. A 1st grader, 2 3rd graders, and 2 5th graders, all packed in for a 35-minute ride. I have no idea how she got away with it, but that situation could have gone horribly wrong. Story 30. My dad, whom I rarely saw, invited my big sister and me to the Capitol to visit an amusement park. My sister was skeptical, saying, "Why would he do that?" But I convinced her to go because I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years. When we arrived and were waiting outside the amusement park, my sister got a call from him, telling us to come to the other side of the city. She sighed and said something like, "Here we go." I started crying because I had been so excited to go in, but eventually we got on the bus. When we arrived, we found out why he had really called us. He wanted my sister to be a witness at his wedding to his new girlfriend, whom neither of us had ever met. After the ceremony, they just told us we could do whatever we wanted. They had never planned on taking us to the amusement park. My sister, though, refused to let me be disappointed. She took me there anyway and paid for everything herself. At the time, I didn't fully understand why my dad had done what he did, only that it made me sad that he didn't show up for us. But I still remember my sister muttering, "Forget that lying jerk," or something similar. That was the last time I ever saw him. This had been going on for years, and only now, looking back, do I truly understand. He never cared about us. Story 31. I have never told anyone this, not even myself out loud. In fourth grade, I was living in the Middle East. Our school was next to a high school, and once students reached seventh or eighth grade, they entered through a different entrance. My reading teacher sometimes brought in a student from the high school, a kind of teaching assistant who would help fill in for him. One morning, when I arrived at school for the morning lineup, this TA approached me and asked if I wanted to do warm-up exercises with him. The entire school was gathered outside, so I didn't think anything of it. But instead of taking me to the field, he led me to the boys' restroom. That day, and for 2 weeks after, he did things to me that I didn't fully understand at the time. I only remember pain, discomfort, my vision blurring, and possibly passing out. One day I came home to my parents asking why the school had called, saying I hadn't been showing up for morning lineup. It confused them because my dad drove me and my 3 siblings to school every day. There was no way I should have been missing it. I panicked. I was so embarrassed. I told them I had been playing with a friend. They kept pressing me. Who? What were you doing? Until I finally broke down crying and begged them to stop asking. They let it go. Story 32. When I was about 7 or 8, my friend invited me to a vacation Bible school program at his church. At one point, I went to the water fountain by myself and noticed a man leaning against a metal gate, surrounded by empty beer cans. He was turned away so I couldn't see his face. I just stood there staring, wondering what he was doing. Before I could say anything, an adult found me and quickly ushered me back into the classroom. I remember looking out the window and seeing sheriff's deputies and other official-looking people arriving. My mom picked me up soon after, but she never explained what had happened. Maybe because it was the mid-'80s, or maybe because she just didn't want to talk about it. I never found out until years later. That man had taken his own life, hanging himself from the gate. I still think about him sometimes. Did he have a family? A wife? Kids? How often does he cross their minds? Story 33. I found my mother's body when I was 7. She was hanging over the bathtub, naked, as if she had been about to draw a bath and had just passed out. At first, I thought she was sleeping. I patted her back and called out, "Mom!" I even lifted her head, but her face was a deep purplish color, and somehow that still didn't clue me in. Eventually, I gave up and went to wake my dad. I sat at the foot of his bed and turned on the real Ghostbusters cartoon while he slowly got up. Then I heard the commotion from the back of the trailer. One of my sisters rushed past me, crying. The second came through, and when I asked what was going on, she blurted out, "Mom's dead." But even then, it still didn't sink in. It wasn't until I saw my dad crying that I knew it was real. My sisters and I sat on the couch as EMTs struggled to pull her past us, her covered body illuminated by the morning sunlight streaming through the living room. I'll never forget that day. I've had a lot of incredibly difficult moments in my life, but that one is in its own category. Technically, it happened just 15 minutes later, but that was still later in life. And the older I get, the more I realize just how far from normal it really was. Story 34. When I was about 16, not quite a child, I guess, my family traveled to India to volunteer in elementary schools, helping teach children English. The group we went with arranged a weekend getaway, so my family and about 5 college-age volunteers went to a small mountain town called Manali. It was an incredible experience. The first night, we ate at a nice hotel restaurant. It was the first truly good meal any of us had eaten in about 2 weeks. Halfway through the meal, another customer suddenly smashed his wine glass and used the stem to stab the hotel manager multiple times. The manager survived. My dad is a doctor, and when the attacker ran off, my dad took the injured man to the back and helped patch up several shallow wounds on his back. At the time, it was a shocking and traumatizing event, but it wasn't until years later that I fully processed what had happened. With each stab, the glass must have shattered further, meaning every wound wasn't just a stab wound. It had shards of glass embedded in it. Story 35. My parents divorced when I was 3, and I never knew why until I was 25. One night during a drunken conversation at a bar, My sister told me a story I had always thought was just a strange dream. When I was 3 and she was 5, we overheard our mom fighting with our dad over the phone. The only words I remember clearly were hooker and jail. Hours later, we were sitting with my mom and my grandfather, our dad's father, when there was a violent pounding on the door. My mom rushed us into the coat closet just as the front door was kicked in. My dad barged inside, shoved his own father to the ground, and hit my mom in the face. Then he started running around, yelling for my sister and me. We watched through the crack in the closet door as my mom jumped on his back and locked in a near-perfect chokehold until he passed out. She left him lying there, took us to McDonald's, and we never talked about it again. When I told my mom I remembered it, she was shocked. She had assumed I was too young to remember and felt terrible for never telling me the truth. Story 36. This didn't happen to me, but to my dad when he was a kid. He grew up in a small town in Canada, and when he was around 10 or 11, he worked on an older man's farm. The farmer made it clear that my dad could roam wherever he wanted, except for one specific room. Of course, telling a 10-year-old not to go somewhere is basically an invitation. One afternoon, my dad went wandering, looking for something, and found himself inside the forbidden room. What he saw stayed with him for years. The walls were lined with pelts from lions, tigers, and other rare animals. Some had price tags on them. The farmer caught him almost immediately and hurried him out, telling him not to come back. At the time, my dad didn't fully grasp what he had seen, and he never told anyone. Years later, when it finally dawned on him, it was too late. I recently asked him about it, and he told me that years after his encounter, the farmer was caught illegally selling exotic animal pelts. He wasn't the one hunting them himself, but he was profiting from someone else's crimes. My dad still feels guilty for not saying anything when he had the chance. Story 37. When I was a kid, I used to play at my friend's house 2 doors down. I was there 2 or 3 days a week for years. His bedroom was right next to his uncle's room, but we were strictly told never to go in there, under any circumstances. There was always a strange smell coming from inside, and in all the time I spent at that house, I only saw his uncle a handful of times. He always looked sickly and disheveled. One day we saw police dragging the uncle out in handcuffs. Turns out he had been running a meth lab. The room we were told never to enter was where he was cooking it. That odd smell? Meth fumes. I was only 8. I didn't understand what meth was, and after the initial shock, the neighborhood moved on. It was a nice area, so I guess people just didn't want to talk about it. For years, I mostly forgot about it. But after high school, I started to learn about what meth does to people. One day, I mentioned where I had grown up, and someone casually brought up a meth lab that had been busted in that area. That's when it really hit me. I had spent years playing just feet away from a dangerous drug operation. I also developed some mental health struggles as a teenager. I can't say for sure if they were related, but sometimes I wonder. Story 38. I aged out of the foster system, so I lived in quite a few households as a kid. One of the first real connections I ever made was with a foster brother who was a year older than me. He took me under his wing and treated me like family, which meant a lot since I was 6 at the time, with no real concept of what family even was. One year, some bikes were donated to us as Christmas presents. It was incredible. I had never really owned anything before, aside from a few pieces of clothing. Getting a bike all to myself, one that I didn't have to share, was mind-blowing. My foster brother's bike was slightly better than mine, and it even had pegs on the back. I'll admit, I was a little jealous of those pegs, but not in any serious way. We spent our summers in the dirt field behind our house, bimingsing, and doing jumps off whatever makeshift ramps we could build. Sometimes neighborhood kids would join us, but for the most part, it was just the 2 of us. One morning, we arrived at our usual dirt mound and saw a couple of teenagers hanging out there. We decided to show off, attempting to impress them with our BMX skills. But they barely paid attention, except when it came to my foster brother's pegs. They kept trying to lure us away from our bikes, which I now realize was a setup to steal them. When we didn't fall for their tricks, one of them finally demanded my foster brother hand over the pegs. He refused. Those bikes were our prized possessions. My memory gets hazy after that, but I remember a gun being pulled out. To this day, I don't know if the teenager fired it on purpose or if it went off by accident. The bullet entered my foster brother's left eye and exited through his neck. I vividly remember his body going limp as he hit the ground. I don't remember running inside or calling for help, but I do remember one thing. I was obsessed with making sure they didn't take his bike. I kept asking our foster mom to go outside and get it, insisting that my brother would want it when he came back from the doctor. That night, I even stood at my window trying to signal the police to grab it. I didn't fully understand what had happened. In my mind, he had gone to the doctor, and doctors fix people. I even asked if she thought he would need stitches, but I never saw him again. Within days of the shooting, I was removed from the home and placed back into state care at a boys' home. I asked my caseworkers every day when I would get to see my brother. They always gave vague answers, never once telling me the truth. Eventually, caseworker turnover meant I had a steady stream of new workers who had no idea who I was even talking about. And so, my brother faded into a memory, and I grew up. As an adult, I finally looked him up and pieced together the full story. Deep down, I think I had always known the truth, but it was good to finally know for sure. I even managed to find his grave, and whenever I'm in the area, I visit. Story 39. Compared to some of the stories people share, this might seem minor, but it did a lot of damage that I'm still dealing with today. I caught my mom cheating on my dad with a house guest, a man everyone considered a close family friend. Some backstory. This man had been a family friend for years. He and my uncle met while working on a farm long ago, and my family essentially adopted him, his wife, and his kids into our circle. At the time of this story, he was working as a long-haul trucker and going through a nasty divorce. My dad, being generous, offered him our spare bedroom whenever he was in town so he wouldn't have to pay for a hotel or stay at his ex-wife's house. One weekend, he came home from a long job and had extra money to burn, so he bought a ton of alcohol for himself and my parents, and they all decided to celebrate. I should mention that I was around 13 at the time, old enough to notice things but still incredibly naive. I didn't fully understand what was happening. I just knew that I hated when they all drank together. My mom acted strange, the house guest got weird, and my dad got angry. At the time, I thought he was just mad because they were being annoying. That night, around 11:30, things started winding down. Everyone was tired and thinking about going to bed. Then the house guest got a call from his ex-wife. She had a talent for making him furious, and after their conversation, he stormed outside, seemingly ready to get in his truck and drive straight to her house in a drunken rage. My mom followed him, trying to stop him. Drunk driving is dangerous, and yelling at an already irrational person wouldn't solve anything. They were outside for a long time, half an hour at least. My dad, annoyed, told me to go to bed, then went to bed himself, but I couldn't sleep. I started spiraling, running through different scenarios in my head. Had they left together? Were they in an accident? Did she get arrested? None of it made sense. Eventually, I worked up the courage to check. I stepped outside and took maybe 2 steps before I heard it. Moaning, everything inside me froze. My stomach dropped. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. And then, I made a mistake. I woke up my dad. He wasn't happy to be disturbed, but I explained how long they had been gone and my fears that something had happened. I left out the moaning. I was hoping I had imagined it, that it was just a misunderstanding. I just wanted him to check. He did, and he caught them. I wish I hadn't sent him out there. I wish he hadn't seen what he saw. I don't remember much else about that night or the morning after. Trauma has a funny way of blurring things out. All I know is that I didn't sleep at all, and for a week, I couldn't even look at my mom. Sorry for the long story. Once I started writing, everything just poured out. Like I said, it's not as extreme as some of the stories here, but it shattered my world. And honestly, it feels good to finally get it all out. If you read this, thanks for listening.